Thank you, Margareta. Thank you also, Loet, for the opportunity of this presentation. I will follow Loet's argumentation in chapter 2 and 3 of his last book. So let me share my desktop here. It is okay for you?
Yes. Yes. Clearly.
So I will begin with the main arguments that are at the center of the chapters 2 and 3. The author, Leydesdorff, sustains the social character of knowledge in detail in chapter 3, but also already in chapter 2, commenting David Blue's sociology of scientific knowledge and the sociological strong program. This is the point of departure of the main argument of the chapter 3. Starting with Blue's main thesis, the strong program is condensed in a formula. Knowledge for the sociologist is whatever men take to be knowledge. As a general idea, the thesis is convincing, but regarding scientific knowledge as knowledge submitted to tests and procedures of validation and justification in a community, distributed in networks, the general formula requires further development and concretization. According to Leydesdorff, indeed, the development of a sociological theory of scientific knowledge relies on the notion of the triple helix linking descriptions of cognitions, agents' strategies, and dissemination of texts. To introduce the triple helix hypothesis, he describes the evolution of perspectives in sociology of science from the monological approach, mainly identified with the dualism subject-object or man-nature of the Cartesian tradition, to a dialogical understanding that stresses the discursive praxis and social, interactional, institutional, and self-organizing aspects of the communication of science in networks. In the book, the transition from the monological model to the dialogical was not scrutinized from an historical point of view, but only hypothesized. He begins his discussion of the communicative turn in philosophy of science with the distinction between context of discovery and context of justification. He ascribes to Popper in the logic of scientific discovery in chapter 2. However, the distinction was not introduced by Popper, but by Hans Reichenbach in Experience and Prediction from 1938. In his book, Reichenbach was dealing with what he called rational reconstruction of knowledge according to the three tasks of epistemology: descriptive, critical, and advisory tasks. I quote from Reichenbach's original distinction. The way, for instance, in which a mathematician publishes a new demonstration or a physicist is logical reasoning in the foundation of a new theory would almost correspond to our concept of rational reconstruction, and the well-known difference between the thinker's way of finding this theorem and his way of presenting it before a public may illustrate the difference in question. I shall introduce the terms context of discovery and context of justification to mark this distinction. Reichenbach's distinction seems appropriate, but one needs to avoid the excessive separation of both domains, discovery and justification. The refraining of such abstract separation of the domains is even more important in a sociological approach. Also, Popper, in the logic of scientific discovery, alerted already for the inconveniences arising from a description of scientific statements exclusively based on empirical data, such as the protocol statements of logical positivism, Carnap, and also Reichenbach, with no intervention of theoretical arguing. Across the first and second parts of the logic of scientific discovery, Popper rejected the myth of induction and proposed his own notion of the principle of falsification against the claims of positivism with its principle of verification, Wittgenstein and Carnap versions. In Leydesdorff account of the interaction between the two contexts, the context of discovery and the context of justification, a double movement, bottom-up and top-down, is envisaged. A circle of discovery and justification describes better what Leydesdorff means by a cybernetic cycle of cognitive claims and control over these claims, the movement from the level of the formation of variation and the next order control mechanism in page 44. Here again, the image of a movement bottom-up and top-down incurs in the risk of a mechanical overlapping of discovery and justification. In his account, Reichenbach's context of justification operates at a discursive level of the validation of knowledge obtained at the context of discovery. But this seems to entail the idea of a pre-linguistic or pre-semiotic formation of observation and induction, which should be avoided. The discursive level is embedded in communication and communicative strategies used by the participants. Instead of a monological validation of cognitive claims, Leydesdorff refers dialogue as the new mode for generating, validating, and reproducing knowledge. Science, thus, is discursive knowledge, which means that it has a communicative dimension open to codification in socially shared symbols in a variety of ways. Communication of science occurs through written discourse and a variety of corpora, such as letters, books, and journals, evolutionary described in some notes of the second chapter of Leydesdorff's book. Before accessing the codes, it is important to refer that communication of science entails also networks. Networking in science communication is already noticeable in Europe across the correspondence of scientists and philosophers in the so-called République des Lettres, the 16th and from the 16th to the 18th centuries. Written communication of science in periodicals, networks used for dissemination of knowledge, procedures of validation such as peer review and citations can be seen as four major aspects in the assessment of the context of justification of cognitive claims of modern scientific discourse. Modern citation of written scientific contexts is a good example of a written code that can be measured and assessed according to absolute quantities, frequency, and power of dissemination in specific networks of related themes. The object of scientometrics is the description of self-organizing patterns occurring in the written communication of science in defined networks of scientific publications with the respective procedures of control. The dissemination of science in networks can be assessed by scientometrics through the scrutiny of the distribution of citations according to figure 2.2. I would add to the account of modern scientific citation the sociological notion of reputation. Reputation, as well as peer recognition, are sociological concepts connected to motivation and the attainment of goals in scientific endeavors, which can be identified in the way citations of own work are targeted and expected. Leydesdorff refers Luhmann's theory of society as a valuable analytic model for science communication and stabilization of expectations regarding cognitive claims, which is essential in the context of justification. His description of Luhmann's theory of society, in his description of Luhmann's theory of society, one distinguishes between the levels of interactions, organizations, and self-organization. The three levels are also present in the case of communication of science, where one can identify agents, material processes that stabilize and globalize cognitive claims, paradigms in Kuhn's terminology. And I quote, "The reproduction of communication is anchored on the one hand in the layer of agents carrying the communications from below, but on the other hand, communications are selected from above at the supra-individual level with reference to next-order structures, such as the codes of communication, emerging within the communicative networks as meta-representations which span horizons of meaning." Page 44. The so-called next-order structures are outcomes of self-organizing networks used for science dissemination and validation. In this aspect of the self-organizing networks, Leydesdorff refers the work of Bruno Latour. He develops critical comments on Hans and the sociology of translation with illustrations from the work of Latour and Michel Calon in chapter 3. Here, he proposes a correction of Hans according to his own view of a triple helix made of cognitions, texts, and agents interacting, but with relative autonomous meanings at each level in face of the others, restricting thus the value of a pan-semiotic representation of reality and cognition in the case of Latour's works. Leydesdorff's insistence in the relative autonomy of the dynamics of each level of the triple helix is reflected in the following thesis. Different meanings can be expected on the basis of different grouping rules. For example, one can distinguish between the meaning of a publication in cognitive terms at the field level, and in social terms at the level of the research group, page 53. Relying on Parsons and Luhmann theories of symbolically generalized media, peer review of texts is regarded as a selective process that ends with the attribution of a cognitive social symbolic value to cognitive claims contained in a submitted text. I would add to this meanings in the reputation scale. The code was described by Luhmann as truth, not truth, but Leydesdorff prefers a heuristic approach as truth-finding, puzzle-solving. The form and evolution of the evaluation of texts entailing cognitive claims, peer review is an example, reveal how expectations and rationalized expectations occur in the communication of science instead of a process of interchange of beliefs of isolated scientists. Thank you.